Hey, thanks for joining me today for episode 42 of Podcasting Your Brand. I'm your host, producer Jemmy, providing learning lessons for you to podcast your brand. And today I'm going to share part 4 of this series of episodes, the technical side of launching, also known as publishing and submitting to the platforms. This episode is brought to you by my own brand, Flintstone Media. Listen in and let's do this. Welcome to the final episode of covering the basics of launching your podcast. You thought through the ins and outs of the concept of your show through the initial series of episodes, Thoughts Before Launching. And so far, through the technical side of launching, you've gotten your equipment, learned how to connect it for remote sessions, learned how to record those sessions, prepped your space to optimize your sound, created a trailer, and put your show art together. Woo! Oh my goodness, are you tired yet? Well, don't be tired. Pep yourself right back up because congratulations, you are ready to launch. And that just takes these last 2 steps: setting up your podcast hosting account and submitting your show to the podcast platforms, also known as publishing and distribution. So let's dive into publishing your podcast. First, a quick note on my background. I used to be a website designer and developer. And when I wanted to start my first podcast way back when, I was surprised to find out that this part of the technical process is a lot like publishing a website. See, a website is really just a bunch of files stored on a server somewhere in the world. And a web browser, Chrome, Safari, rest in peace, Internet Explorer, whatever browser you use, reads those files to know what to display on your device. And that's what you see as a website. With a podcast, behind the scenes, it works basically the same way. Your podcast is also a bunch of files stored on a server somewhere in the world. And podcast players are like web browsers reading those files. But instead of displaying a website, they play a podcast. So that's what this episode covers. And it starts with publishing your podcast. Luckily for you, though, it's gotten super stinking easy over these last few years to do this. And it's really inexpensive too. I don't think I've ever paid more than maybe $20 a month for a show's hosting service. And that brings me to the topic of hosting account companies. There's lots to choose from, just like there's GoDaddy or HostMonster or whoever for hosting a website. There are companies for hosting your podcast too. There are a few that I will mention by name because they have been tried and true for years. And I have met and had the privilege of getting to know the humans behind them over these years as well. But I'll keep my list short and sweet. As mentioned in other episodes in this series, I'm trying to keep these episodes as evergreen as possible. So my quick hit list is Libsyn, which is short for Liberated Syndication and spelled Libsyn. If you do go with them, feel free to use my promo code IGNITE, IGNITE, and receive your first month of hosting for free. Then there's Buzzsprout, another great company. Between Libsyn and Buzzsprout, I probably manage about 50 different shows on those 2 platforms. So they've been really good to me over the years. And special mention also goes to Blueberry, spelled Blubry, no E's in Blueberry. Blubry, and Podbean. I've gotten to know them over the years as well, and they are both really great companies to work with too. Now, there are a lot more out there, especially as new ones have been coming on the scene in these last couple of years. But these 4, I would bet, would still be around for as long as this show is serving new podcasters. They've all 4 been especially supportive of the independent podcaster and have great customer support. And as a former data analyst and complete nerd, they all have good statistics suites too. And one of them is the title sponsor of my other show, the Podfest podcast. So there's that too. But when I speak of hosting in this case, it doesn't mean hosting the show, as in the person leading the ship on the microphone, like I'm the host of this show, but rather the company who is providing hosting services for your podcast files themselves. And that's what all these podcast hosting companies do. Now, a quick word on free podcast hosting. There's that saying that if you don't pay for a product, then you are the product. And as I've watched free podcast hosting services come on the scene, and some honestly leaving the scene for whatever fell through with them business-wise, I've seen various ways that the red flag of being free has reared its ugly head. There was one company in particular that really ticked me off because they would have this option at the end of signing up with them for them to submit the show to all the platforms with a simple touch of a single button. And it was a big shiny button. And then there was like a tiny little mundane looking link for you to click instead to opt into doing it yourself. But the big shiny button was a complete shiny object play and caused a lot of problems for creators because this company would submit the show to Apple iTunes, as an example, under an email address associated with them rather than your own, thereby claiming ownership of your show on that major platform. Total nightmare. But I've seen that behavior and the behavior of other free platforms slowly change for the better. Though I will say that if you don't pay for a product, then you still are the product. It's still true. It just may not be as obvious moving forward now how each of these free platforms will play that concept out. Just something for you to be aware of, but for sure, just know that your show must be submitted to the platforms under your email address for ownership purposes. Another bad practice I've seen from some free hosting services is replacing your audio's unique file name with a consistent file name for your show for each episode of your show. I won't get into the technical weeds of what this means, but if you ever want to switch companies in the future, having your hosting company retain the unique file name of your episode's original audio file is super helpful because it's easier for your new hosting company to move things over for you that way. I'm convinced that those hosting companies that change the file names to be the same base name, honestly, which I don't understand the logic behind it at all, but I'm pretty fairly convinced that these companies either, one, don't understand the tech behind podcasting, or two, understand it all too well and want to make it purposely difficult to leave their service and transfer everything over to a new hosting company. Either way, it doesn't foster trust and confidence, in my humble opinion. So there's just been some weird, sticky practices from free hosting companies over the years, and there's almost nothing worse than finding out down the line that you don't own your show's content or have given up some rights to control it, or that it's going to be a complete headache to switch hosting companies in the future if you need to. So pay attention to the hosting platform's terms of service. For me, in my experience, it has never been worth it to get free hosting. And as I said, podcast hosting services are super affordable. So if you can't make that maybe $20 commitment every month for your show, you also may not be ready to invest the sweat equity it's going to take for your show to be successful. I'm just saying. And all platforms, including those that I prefer and have recommended by name here, are constantly updating. In fact, Blueberry just updated their back-end dashboard, improving their overall user experience, including their statistics suite. I got to speak with Todd, the founder of Blueberry, at the most recent PodFest event, and he showed it to me, and it's gorgeous. So they are constantly updating. They're incorporating new tools, features, and functions just to keep up with each other and with customer demand. So don't try to burn yourself too much with which hosting account to sign up for in the first place. And on that note, as a final note, this one is on how to decide which service is best for you. So you've narrowed it down to a few good ones. Fantastic. Again, I personally recommend Libsyn, Buzzsprout, Blueberry, or Podbean. But how do you decide? Well, I think the most important thing to look at are the extra bells and whistles they may offer as far as their features are concerned. All of these companies offer the same core service functions, but they vary a bit in the extras. So Is there anything in particular that you want or you need? If you're looking for something like that, like being able to create audiograms through their service, or being able to publish text-only posts, or to be able to publish video episodes, or have alternative audio files for each episode, depending on what you're trying to do, being able to do dynamic advertising if that's what you're going for, etc., etc. Each of these services provides a little something different in their extras. But since their core services are pretty universal, then I would suggest you do a quick Google search for the images of each hosting service's backend dashboards. Then from those images, try to judge which service seems like it'll be the most intuitive for you to use. That's probably your best bet because you'll be more likely to enjoy the user experience. And if down the line you want to change your mind and go with a different company, it's a pretty basic process that their customer service should be able to largely handle for you. Again, I can at least vouch for these main 4 that I've mentioned. So let's talk about those universal basic functions for those hosting accounts and get your show published. Here's what you need for setting up your show's hosting account: your title, your description, your email address to set as a show owner, your name or your business's name to also put in as the owner, your payment method, your show art, and your trailer episode. Those are the essentials. Just make sure that you fill in everything available to you. Some of these platforms have the opportunity for you to add a whole host of additional information, and all of that can add to your show's SEO or search engine optimization and better help it come up in search results on podcast platforms. So fill in all of it. The additional info could be your name as the host and also information on the host like your bio and your headshot. It can be a section for keywords, which are words and phrases related to your show. It could be the option to add in that horizontal version of your show art that I talked about on the last episode too. Whatever it is, fill it all out. All of that information helps to optimize your hosting account to maximize your podcast's discoverability. Now, I find it my civic duty to share my thoughts on hosting your podcast files on your website. This is an option that not too many people think of, but some do. So I want to nip that idea in the bud right away. It is a totally terrible idea for 3 main reasons. Reason number 1, your show's audio files build up to a lot of data storage over time. And as your show becomes more and more successful, the number of times that those files are going to get pinged to be downloaded by a listener will go up and up and up. That's what you want, right? Success. But guess what else will go up and up and up? Your website hosting service bill. Woohoo! Far more than anything you'd be paying monthly to a podcast hosting service provider. Reason number 2, unless you are a highly skilled web developer, as I once was, you run a great risk of messing up your podcast. First of all, you have to be able to set up your podcast to facilitate the RSS feed URL that you need to be able to add your show to the podcast players. Skipping past whether you're technically savvy enough for that or not, especially because there are more and more plugins coming on the scene to make this sort of thing easier nowadays. So skipping past the setup, you then have to maintain it. And the thing is that with a website, there are a lot of reasons that it could go down. It could be hacked. You can add a plugin that breaks it. You can add a plugin that's perfectly fine, but another plugin on your website doesn't jive with it, so that breaks it. Your website's framework is out of date, etc., etc., etc. And if your website goes down, so does your podcast. Ruh-roh. And reason number 3, the stats. Podcast hosting services will provide you with the stats you need to help you with audience growth, help you land sponsorships, etc., etc. And those stats can be very detailed, including telling you where in the world your audience is, what devices they're listening on, how much of each episode they're consuming before dropping off, which of your episodes are the most popular, how your show is doing month over month, et cetera, et cetera. So creating and tracking a statistics suite on your own for your podcast that is reliable and that your potential sponsors will trust is difficult, to say the least. So just use a podcast hosting service and save yourself the headache. Okay, you may have noticed that one of those things on my list of items to check off when setting up your hosting account is adding your show art. So that's why on the last episode, I explained that that was one of the 2 assets you're going to need. And finalizing your hosting account also requires one other asset, and I mentioned it in my list, your trailer, also part of the last episode. You'll need to go ahead and publish your trailer, now that you have it, right away as your first episode 0 or 1 or whatever. Make sure that you have for it the title, which can be just Welcome to and the name of your show, or Preview of and the name of your show, whatever, okay? A short description, which can honestly just be an adaptation of your show description, and links to you, your website, your social media, etc. Load up your audio, fill in everything for it, the title, description, link section, keywords, etc., and hit publish. Guess what? Congratulations! You now have a published podcast. And the crowd goes wild. Now, all that's left in launching is your show's distribution. And that means submitting your show to the platforms. One of the most exciting moments of this whole journey of launching. If it wasn't already created during the process of creating your hosting account, publishing your initial trailer episode triggers your hosting company to create your podcast's RSS feed URL. I'm sorry, create my podcast. What, producer Jemmy? Okay, remember how I was saying that the tech behind the scenes of launching your show is a lot like it is for creating a website? Well, your podcast's RSS feed URL is like its address on the web, just as a website's URL is its address on the web. Same thing. So it actually looks like a link, but often with the letters RSS in it. Not always, but usually. And if you take your show's RSS feed URL and plug it into a web browser, like you would with a web address, you'll see all the info about your podcast, probably just looking like a bunch of computer code, because essentially that's what it is. And it's that RSS feed URL for your show that directs the podcast players to where on the internet to go find your show and read the files and play it for your listeners. It's truly your show's address on the web, and that's what you need to submit your show to the platforms, your RSS feed URL. So, what platforms am I talking about here? Well, again, I'm trying to keep this evergreen. And just as with the podcast hosting platforms a few minutes ago, I'm going to name the podcast player platforms that I'm pretty confident will still be around no matter when you find this episode. These include Apple iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Google. With most of the major podcast platforms, you have to submit your show by creating an account with them. And as of the recording of this episode, this includes Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, and Google. And 2 quick notes on Apple iTunes. You'll want to search for Apple Podcasts Connect, and that should bring the website you need up right away. And even though it's free, you won't be able to add your podcast to Apple iTunes without having a payment method set up in your iTunes account. Don't ask me why, but you want to check for that if you aren't able to submit your show. If you have your show art, your trailer, and your ownership email address set up in your podcast hosting account, as I just walked you through, and you still aren't able to add your show to Apple, you're still getting an error, it's probably because your iTunes billing account information is missing. And also for Apple iTunes, transfer of ownership of your show from one account to another is next to impossible. So be sure you consider carefully which Apple ID you want to submit it under. Once you decide, If you're like, well, I don't know what my account name and credentials are. Yes, you do. Yes, you do. If you're on an iPhone and you go in to download an app and it asks you for your credentials, that's exactly what you need. Same set of credentials for iTunes Podcast Connect. Now, TuneIn is a major podcast player where you do have to submit your show manually, but you don't have to create an account with them to do so. So just go to TuneIn and you can submit your show manually. And luckily, once you get your show set up in those platforms, there's not much work for you to do after that, because a vast majority of the rest of the platforms out there pull from Apple iTunes, especially using it as a directory. So within a few days, the rest of the platforms should all find your show. However, some of these you still will need to go into because they have a way for you to claim your podcast on their platform. Good Pods is an example. They pull from iTunes. So as long as you submit to iTunes, your show will end up on Good Pods shortly thereafter, regardless. But you want to go into Good Pods and claim your podcast so it shows up on your profile. And so no one else claims what's yours, right? But no matter when you are launching, I can almost guarantee that there's been a recent addition to the collection of podcast players. So do a search or ask a podcast group to be sure you aren't missing anything. And you don't want to neglect any platforms on purpose either, just because you may not have heard of them or they're based in a foreign country and primarily serve foreign audiences. You never know where your show's going to hit, and it doesn't hurt to be everywhere. So it's also a good rule of thumb to check in with the industry now and then and see if any new platforms have popped up that you have to submit your show to. As an example, the Pick Cherries podcast app launched only about 6 months before I recorded this episode, and that's one that you have to submit your show to. So by paying attention and knowing that the app was available, I was able to get all of my and my clients' shows submitted to Pick Cherries very early. And as you are going along and submitting your show, the platforms may send you a confirmation email that contains the link address for your show on their platform. Collect those URLs in a list and keep it handy. And for any platforms that don't email you, just go to the platform, search for your show, and copy the link. But that list will be especially handy when adding a landing page for your podcast to your website or creating a whole new website for it. With all of those URLs collected, you'll be able to include a section of links for your show on each platform. That way, listeners, when visiting your website, can choose to play it on the platform they prefer. But yeah, congrats! You're launched! As a reminder, this was the last core launch episode. As mentioned on the last episode, moving forward, I'll be labeling my episodes as either Podcasting Level 101 or Level 102. And I am beyond excited for you to sink your teeth into all the rest of the content I'm going to be sharing with you on the show to help you be successful as you podcast your brand. And as a quick mention, if you're podcasting your brand, whether a personal brand or a business brand, then it's probably because you want to gain brand exposure and further monetize your expertise. So take it all just one step further and check out the app created by my friend Jason. It's the OWL app, spelled with 2 W's and 2 L's. Monetize your expertise on OWL, going active when you want to, and taking calls from people seeking your advice. I'm on there for one-on-one on-demand coaching sessions, so download the app and watch for when I'm live so we can connect. I'd love to answer your questions. And become an expert on the app yourself. It's a great way to land some extra clients too, so check out OWL. I have a link in the show notes as always, and sign up with my referral code to get your $10 credit. The referral code is PL954123. In the meantime, I have a whole host of free tips for you on my website. Just check out flintstonemedia.com/free tips. Thanks for tuning in for Podcasting Your Brand. In this new chapter of the show, I'm revealing how you can harness the power of podcasting to expand your brand. So come and pick up what I've been putting down since 2014. Avoid everyone else's common mistakes and propel your podcasting and branding forward. And if you have questions or interested in becoming a sponsored brand of this show, don't be shy. Reach out to me. It's super easy. Just email me at Jaime, spelled Jaime, at flintstonemedia.com. It's producer Jaime signing off for now. Remember, the only thing more powerful than your voice is your spirit to use it. So turn that mic on.